Arizona Territory, 1888. The wind outside the Red Rock Saloon carried dust and heat like it was angry about something, but inside, Florence Dillard just sat still, hands folded tight on her lap, staring at the glass of water the barkeep had set in front of her out of pity. No one else had spoken to her since she walked in. She had been waiting for 2 hours. The lace on her dress was too fine for this town, her boots too clean, her wide-brimmed hat still holding its shape. She stuck out like a sore thumb in a place where the women wore calico and the men smelled of horses and old whiskey. A folded paper sat tucked into her satchel, the words bought and paid for burned into her mind. Mail order bride, bargain price. No family left to object after the fever took her parents last winter in Kansas. She had answered an ad placed by a rancher looking for a wife only to arrive and find out he'd died 3 weeks ago from a snakebite. His brother, a heavy-shouldered man with yellow teeth, offered to take her instead since she was already here. She had walked out of his house and into this saloon. Now she sat alone in a town that had no place for her. The piano stopped playing. Someone cursed in the corner. The door creaked open, and a gust of desert heat followed the man who stepped in. He was tall, lean, and sun-worn, with dust on his boots and a hole in the brim of his hat. His shirt had a tear at the shoulder. He looked like he had not eaten a full meal in days. Florence barely glanced up until he stopped right beside her. He took off his hat, held it in both hands. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said. His voice was low, careful. "Are you alone?" She turned, ready to give a sharp answer, but his eyes held no mockery, just tiredness. And something else, something like worry. "I am," she said. "Who's asking?" "Name's Boone Carter," he said. "I do not mean to bother you truly, He paused, swallowing hard. "You are not from here, I can tell." Florence held her chin a little higher. "No, I am not. You, born in Texas." "Raised up in bad luck," he said with the ghost of a smile. "Been drifting a while. I'm not much to look at, but I swear I am honest." She narrowed her eyes. "What do you want?" Boone looked down, then back at her. He licked his lips, nervous. "I want to marry you." Florence blinked. "Is this a joke?" "No, ma'am." She stared at him. "You do not even know me." "I could," he said, voice quiet, "if you let me." He looked like he meant it. His hands trembled where they gripped his hat. She could see the hunger in his thin frame, the desperation in his voice. But there was no cruelty in him, no mocking grin, no leer, just a man who had nothing, asking for something good. "Sit down," she said finally. He did. They sat in silence for a minute. Boone stared at the scuffed table. Florence stared at him. "You got any money?" she asked. He shook his head. "Not a cent." "You got a job?" "Not yet, but I can work. I can rope, dig, build. If it needs doing, I will do it." She nodded slowly. "You got a family?" "No, my ma passed when I was 16. Pa drank himself out of our lives before that." Florence let her hands fall to her lap. "The man I was supposed to marry died. His brother offered to take me instead. I walked out." Boone looked at her then, steady. "Good. Why would you want me?" she asked. He looked down, then said, "You look like someone who still believes in decency." Her throat tightened. They talked after that, not about big things, just little ones, where she grew up. What he used to do before his last horse died under him, what she could cook, what he could fix. It was not romantic, it was survival. But something in her chest loosened a little when he laughed at one of her dry remarks. And something in his eyes softened when she asked if he had slept inside last night, and he admitted he had not. The saloon keeper came by, eyeing them both. "You two planning on sitting here all night?" Boone stood. "Sir," he said, voice clear, "can I work for a place to sleep? I will sweep, haul, whatever you need." The man grunted. "You clean up the stables, you can sleep in the hayloft." "I will do it." Boone turned to Florence. "I will come back tomorrow morning. If you do not want to see me again, I will go, but if you do, I will be here," she said. He smiled just a little. "Good night, Miss Florence." She watched him walk out into the dark. The next morning he came back, and the next. They walked, talked. Shared meals when they could. He found odd jobs, cleaned stalls, drove wagons, patched fences. She found work sewing and mending for the general store's owner. They earned enough for bread, beans, a sack of flour. 1 week passed. Then 2. On the third Sunday morning, Boone met her outside the church steps. He held something in his hand. It was a ring rough made from a bent nail and a bit of wire, but shaped with care. "I know it is not much," he said, "but I still mean it. I want to marry you." Florence looked at the ring. Then at him. "I do not want to be alone anymore," she said. He stepped closer. "You will not be, ever again." She reached out and took the ring. When their lips met, it was soft but sure. They married that afternoon, standing under the cottonwood tree outside town with a preacher who owed Boone a favor. She wore the same dress she had arrived in. He wore his cleanest shirt. They held hands, eyes never leaving each other. Afterward, he whispered against her hair, "You saved me, Florence." She pulled back just enough to look at him. "We saved each other." And they walked away, hand in hand, toward the little one-room house Boone had helped build on the edge of town. It was not much, but it was theirs. And it was only the beginning. The soil behind the little house turned hard under Boone's shovel, sun-baked and stubborn. He paused to wipe his brow on his sleeve, the cotton stiff with dust. Behind him, Florence knelt in a patch of shade, coaxing rows of onions into the earth with quiet fingers. A red kerchief covered her hair, tied low at her nape. She hadn't spoken in a while, but Boone didn't take it for silence. With Florence quiet carried weight, he straightened, stretching the ache from his back. "You ever worked land before?" he asked, voice mild. She didn't glance up. "My uncle had a kitchen garden, nothing more than herbs and tomatoes. This is different." He leaned on the shovel. "It is, but you're taking to it." Florence sat back on her heels and looked at him for the first time that morning. Her cheeks glowed with sun, and a smudge of dirt marked one jaw. "I'm trying," Boone nodded. "That's all there is to it." For a while, the only sound was the wind moving through dry grass and the creak of the shovel handle. "I heard the preacher's widow needs someone to help with preserves," she said after a while. "She hasn't managed much since her son left for Flagstaff." Boone tilted his head. "You want to take that on?" "I could use the extra coin, and I don't mind the company." He studied her face, then said, "You don't have to ask me." "I know," she said, "but I want to." He nodded once, slow. "Then do it." That night, the wind stayed still. Warmth clung to the boards of their home, and the oil lamp cast a wide glow over the table where Florence worked needle through cloth. A shirt of Boone's lay spread in her lap, the cuff worn thin. Boone sat on the floor, back against the wall, his legs stretched out. "You ever think about Kansas?" Florence didn't pause her stitching. "Sometimes." "What do you remember most?" "My mother's singing." She had a voice like cooled molasses. Thick and low, Boone rested his head back against the wall. "I don't remember my ma's voice, just her hands, always busy." Florence looked at him, needle paused. "What did she do?" "She boiled lye soap in a kettle and sold it to neighbors. Said clean skin made for clean hearts." He gave a faint laugh. "Didn't do my father much good." Florence set the needle down, folding the shirt in her lap. "You ever wonder if we're doing this right?" Boone met her eyes. "All the time, and we keep doing it anyway." Florence gave a slow nod. "That's enough, I think." Later, when the lamp was out and the crickets hummed in the dark, Florence lay with her head on Boone's shoulder, his arm curled around her back. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Then Boone whispered, "You feel safe?" "Yes," she murmured against his chest. "Do you?" "I never knew what it felt like till now." Days turned to weeks. Florence returned from the widow's house with berry-stained hands and a basket of lids she'd been allowed to keep. Boone took up work repairing the roof of the livery. He came home with tar on his sleeves and a new sunburn across his neck. One evening, as Florence scrubbed the washboard in the yard, Boone walked up with something behind his back. She stood, wiping her hands on her apron. "What is it?" He brought it out, an old, worn copy of Webster's Speller. The cover was cracked, the pages yellowed. "I found it in a crate behind the mercantile," he said. "Figured you might want it." Florence took it, fingers brushing over faded ink. "I haven't read anything since I left home. I remember you said you liked words." She opened to a page at random. Persevere, she read aloud. To persist in anything undertaken, Boone smiled soft. Seems fitting. That night, Florence read aloud while Boone mended a cracked boot sole by lantern light. Her voice was steady, unhurried, like she was tasting each word. Boone never interrupted. After she closed the book, she looked at him across the table. I never thought my life would look like this. Boone set down his tools. Better or worse? Not better, not worse, just real. He reached across and took her hand, his fingers rough and warm. Real's all I ever wanted, she squeezed back. Then we're both getting what we need. The next morning, they hung a new horseshoe above the door. Boone had found it outside the smithy, bent and rusted. He'd polished it clean. Won't bring luck, Florence said, holding the step ladder steady as he nailed it up. Doesn't need to, Boone replied. We've got each other. And with the sun climbing behind them and the wind carrying the scent of mesquite through the air, they stepped back into the house they were shaping day by day with work, with quiet, and with the kind of love that didn't need big words to be known. By late May, the mesquite trees behind the house had bloomed pale yellow, and the first heat of summer settled into the earth like it had no intention of leaving. Florence stood barefoot on the porch, a basin of laundry at her feet and her hair pinned in a coil against her neck. Boone had gone out before dawn to help a neighboring rancher dig a new well. He hadn't said when he'd be back, but he'd taken the canteen she'd filled for him and 2 biscuits wrapped in cloth, so she figured he planned to be gone through the afternoon. She rinsed the last shirt, wrung it out, then hung it over the line stretched between 2 posts. The wind tugged at the sleeves like it was trying to shake hands. She leaned against the porch rail, squinting out toward the scrub. A movement caught her eye, small, quick, low to the ground. A jackrabbit, thin and fast, darted toward the brush. Behind it, a hawk dropped like a stone. The rabbit vanished under a bush. The hawk circled once, then rose up again. Florence watched until both were out of sight. When Boone returned just after sunset, his shirt and boots were caked with red dust, and his left hand was wrapped in a strip of cotton. She met him at the door before he could speak. What happened? He looked down at his hand, sheepish. Caught it on a rusted pulley. It's not deep, just mean. Come inside. He sat at the table while she unwrapped the cloth, fetched her small tin of lard and pine tar, and cleaned the wound with boiled water. He winced once, but didn't pull away. You didn't need to keep working after that, she said, voice steady. I promised I'd finish the trench. Didn't seem right to quit halfway. She pressed the cloth tighter around his hand than necessary. Next time, think first. He looked at her, quiet. I mean it, she said. Boone nodded, contrite. I will. Later, with the lantern burning low, Florence brought out a folded letter. She set it beside his plate. It came while you were gone. Postmark says Abilene. Boone studied the envelope. I don't know anyone there. He opened it slowly, scanning the page, his brow furrowed. Florence waited. It's from a man named Harris. Says he knew my ma when she was young, claims we're second cousins. He read about a Boone Carter out west in a church circular, seems he's been trying to track family. Florence reached for the letter. What does he want? Boone shrugged. Nothing, far as I can tell, just wanted to see if I was alive. She read a line aloud. If you ever find yourself near the Smoky Hill River, I'd be glad to shake your hand. Boone exhaled. Funny thing, having someone want to know you after all this time. Florence placed the letter back on the table. Maybe you'll write him. Maybe, he said. A week later, a traveling peddler came through town with a wagon full of tinware, buttons, and ribbons. Florence traded 2 jars of peach preserves and a stitched handkerchief for a spool of thread and a small mirror framed in tin. She set the mirror on the windowsill where it caught the morning light. Boone noticed it the next day. You want to see yourself more? He asked, brow raised. No. I want to remember how I look when I'm content. He considered that, then nodded. Reckon that's worth keeping. They sat together that evening, Florence with her sewing, Boone with a lasso he was braiding from old rawhide strips. The air was still, the kind that made sounds carry far. Do you ever think about leaving? She asked, eyes fixed on her stitching. Boone didn't answer at first. Only if you're with me. I'm not saying we should, just wondering if you feel tied down. I don't feel tied, I feel rooted. Florence looked up. That's different, it is, he said. I've drifted too long to want loose ground again. She nodded once, then went back to her needle. The next morning, they worked side by side to patch the roof before the monsoon storms rolled in. Boone held the shingles while Florence hammered, her sleeves rolled to the elbow and her brow damp with sweat. Careful, he said as she reached too far toward the edge. I've got it. He steadied her ankle anyway, just in case. When they climbed down, she handed him a dipper of water and leaned against the wall. I like the way you watch out for things, she said. Boone drank and offered her the dipper. I like the way you don't wait for me to do it all. She drank, then smiled at him, tired but sure. That night, thunder rolled in the distance. Boone stood at the door, watching the lightning flicker beyond the ridge. Florence came to stand beside him. Do you miss the wide road? He shook his head. Not when there's something worth staying for. She rested her hand against his arm. You made a home out of nothing. We did, he said. And when the rain came, it struck the roof firm and steady, but inside the light stayed warm and neither of them moved from the doorway, watching the storm pass over together. The monsoons passed early that year, leaving behind a sky rinsed clean and a patch of wild sunflowers sprouting along the fence line. Boone found them one morning while checking the rails, their stalks bent under the weight of gold petals, and cut a few to bring back in his hands. Florence took them wordlessly when he offered, placing them in a chipped mason jar on the washstand without comment. But later that evening, Boone noticed she'd moved the jar to the center of the table, where the light from the window touched every petal. He didn't say anything. He just noticed. A letter arrived a week after the rains cleared, carried in by the woman who kept the post from the back of the dry goods store. Florence opened it slowly, her thumb brushing the coarse paper. Boone waited until she'd read it through twice. It's from a woman in Wichita, she said, folding the page. Mrs. Agnes Norwood. She ran the sewing circle my mother used to lead. He watched her expression. She asking for something? Florence shook her head. She says there's a girl there, Margaret, who's 13, orphaned last winter. She's been kept on at a boarding house, but they can't afford to keep her through harvest. She thought I might know someone who could take her in. Boone leaned forward. Do you? I don't, Florence said, voice quiet. But I don't like the thought of her being turned out. Boone rubbed his jaw, thinking, You think she'd come this far? Florence looked at him steady. Wouldn't ask it if I didn't think she could. He nodded once. Then write her back. Tell her we've got room. Florence didn't speak, but her hand moved across the table and rested on his. He turned his palm up and laced their fingers. 3 weeks later, Margaret arrived on the stage from Prescott, wearing a threadbare coat and holding a small canvas satchel with both hands. She had the narrow shoulders of someone used to being overlooked and eyes that flickered everywhere at once, never resting. Boone tipped his hat when he met her. Ma'am, he said, more formal than usual. Margaret lowered her eyes and nodded. Florence knelt to greet her. We're glad you came, Margaret. The girl's voice was almost too soft to hear. I'll work hard, I promise. You're not here to work, Florence said. You're here to be safe. That night, Margaret slept in the corner room, the one Florence had scrubbed and cleared of boxes. Boone gave her his old wool blanket, patched at the edges but warm. When she woke before sunrise and crept into the kitchen barefoot, Florence handed her a cup of chicory and didn't ask why. By the second week, she'd started to speak more. By the third, she laughed once, sudden and startled, when Boone tripped over the wash bucket. He grinned at her, rubbing his shin. She ducked her head but didn't hide her smile. Boone built a second coop out back using pine scraps and bent nails. Florence and Margaret painted it white, streaky and uneven, but bright against the mesquite. They filled it with hens from a neighbor's clutch, and each morning Margaret brought in the eggs in a straw basket Boone had braided the handles for. One night after Margaret had gone to bed, Florence sat on the front steps, her hands resting in her lap. Boone joined her, leaning one shoulder against the post. You think she'll be all right? He asked. Florence nodded. She just needs time. They watched the stars rise, quiet between them. Boone cleared his throat. "You ever think about having one of our own?" Florence didn't answer right away. "Yes," she said finally, "but I think we were meant to find her first." He looked over at her, the corner of his mouth lifting. "I think you might be right." Autumn came slow and dry. The pumpkins Florence planted behind the shed came up small but bright. Boone bartered for a pair of goats from a man passing through from Holbrook, and Margaret named them Maple and Birch. She fed them by hand and hummed when she thought no one was listening. Late October brought a chill that crept in through the floorboards. Boone added a second layer of sod to the back wall. Florence stitched wool batting into a curtain and hung it across the door. Margaret took to curling up on the rug near the stove, her feet tucked under her skirt and a book in her lap. One night, while Florence mended a hem and Boone carved a bit of scrap wood into something shapeless but smooth, Margaret looked up from her reading. "Do you think things stay good?" she asked, eyes steady. Florence set her needle down. "They stay good when people keep choosing to make them so." Margaret thought about that, then nodded. "All right." Boone tossed the wood in the stove. "That's as true as anything I've heard." Later, when Florence lay curled against Boone, her breath steady against his collarbone, he whispered into the dark, "I never thought this would be my life." She didn't stir, but her hand found his beneath the quilt, fingers laced tight. And Boone, who once wandered with nothing but a busted saddle and an empty pocket, closed his eyes and held her hand like it was the most certain thing in the world. The first frost came in early November, silvering the fence rails and turning the pump handle stiff at dawn. Boone rose before the sun, easing out from beneath the quilt so as not to wake Florence. He dressed by lamplight, pulling on his wool coat, then stepped out into the cold. He checked the goat shelter first. Maple and Birch huddled close, their breath steaming in the air. He refilled their hay and checked the latch on the door. Satisfied, he crossed the yard and entered the small lean to where the tools were kept, pulling out the hand saw and a length of cedar he'd been saving. By the time Florence stepped into the doorway, wrapped in her shawl and rubbing sleep from her eyes, Boone had the board braced across the sawbuck, marked and ready. "You're building something," she said, voice low with sleep. "I am," he answered. "And you're not allowed to ask what." She raised an eyebrow, then smiled faintly. "You're terrible at keeping secrets." He kissed her cheek just once. "You'll see." Inside, Margaret stirred the hearth fire to life and set the kettle on. She'd grown taller in the past month, her sleeves now brushing her elbows, and her hair, once chopped short, hung in uneven waves around her jaw. She tied it back with a scrap of ribbon, then set to kneading the bread dough Florence had left rising overnight. "You want the bigger pan or the small one?" she asked without looking up. Florence pulled her shawl tighter and stepped beside her. "The small pan's fine. Boone's planning something." Margaret's hands didn't slow. "It's the cedar plank, isn't it?" "I saw him sanding it yesterday." Florence gave her a sideways glance. "You didn't tell me." "I figured you'd rather be surprised." Boone worked through the morning, head bent over the wood, shaping it with care and sanding it smooth. When he came in for dinner, his hands were red from the cold and a splinter stuck out of his thumb. Florence wordlessly took his hand and plucked it free with the tip of her needle, then placed a strip of clean muslin over the skin. "There," she said. "Try not to bleed on whatever you're making." He gave her a look, amused but quiet. That evening, after supper, Boone stood by the hearth, holding the finished piece behind his back. "You ready?" he asked. Florence set down her mending. "I suppose I have to be." He stepped forward and placed it in her hands. It was a wooden sign carved with care. The letters were uneven but deep and sure. Dillard Carter below the names. He'd painted a sprig of sage and a single star. Margaret leaned forward, eyes wide. "You're going to hang it over the door?" Boone nodded. "Thought it was time we put our name on something." Florence ran her thumb over the carved edge. "You made this with your hands." "I did." She met his eyes. "Then it's worth more than anything I've ever owned." Boone stepped closer. "I thought maybe we could make it official, you and me and Margaret, that this is our home, not just where we ended up." Florence touched the edge of the sign, then the side of his face. It already is. He leaned forward and kissed her, slow and full, like he was breathing her in. That night, after Margaret had gone to sleep, Boone and Florence lay curled together beneath the quilt. The candle had burned low and the shutters rattled in the wind. Boone traced a line down her arm with his fingertips. "I want to build more," he said into the quiet. "A barn, a new room. Maybe a fence around the back field." Florence shifted closer. "You don't need to do it all at once." "I know, but I want it done right. For you, for her." Florence tilted her face toward his. "You already gave us the only thing we needed. A place that doesn't turn away." Boone rested his forehead against hers. "I love you." Her fingers slid into his, warm and sure. "And I love you." The days shortened. They prepared for winter as a family. Margaret sewed warm linings into her own dresses. Boone reinforced the roof with tar paper and salvaged shingles. Florence bartered for dried beans and salt pork, filling the shelves with enough to last them through the cold months. On the first snow, they woke to the world hushed in white. Boone built a fire while Florence made hot cakes. Margaret stepped outside and caught snowflakes on her sleeve. Watching them melt into her skin, by mid-December, Boone had finished the new barn. It stood behind the house, squat but strong, built of pine and sweat and stubbornness. Florence painted the door blue with leftover milk paint, and Margaret hung a horseshoe above the lintel. Just because it made her smile on Christmas morning, they exchanged simple gifts. Florence gave Boone a new pair of gloves, lined with wool she'd traded sewing work for. Boone carved a small wooden horse for Margaret, its legs sturdy and its mane painted black. Margaret gave Florence a stitched pouch filled with dried lavender. The day passed with quiet warmth. They drank chicory, told stories, and watched the snow fall in slow spirals outside the window. That night, as the fire burned low and the stars blinked through the frost-laced panes, Boone rose and pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. Florence looked up from her chair. "What's that?" "The letter from Abilene," he said. "The cousin." She set her knitting aside. "You never answered it." "No, I kept it though." He stepped closer. I don't need to go back to where I came from. I've got kin here." Florence rose and took his hand. "Then let it rest." He leaned down and kissed her, slow and deep, her arms wrapped around him, sure and steady. Margaret stirred from her cot but didn't rise. She heard the quiet rustle of the fire, the low murmur of voices, and the sound of laughter, gentle, close, true. Years passed and the house grew. Boone built a second room with his own hands. Margaret stayed on, even after she turned 18, even after she was offered a teaching position in Prescott. She chose to stay because home, once found, isn't easily walked away from. Florence kept her lavender pouch by the window, where the sun warmed it each morning. Boone added a porch swing and carved their names into the railing. The Dillard Carter sign weathered but never fell. And every night, long after the lamps were out and the wind whispered through the grass, Florence and Boone lay side by side, their hands always touching, hearts quiet and full. They had built a life not from fortune or ease, but from choice and devotion and the unspoken promise that carried them through every season. I am here. I will stay. Together always.